All right, welcome back, students. We are here now on still chapter 13, but we've moved to 13.2 finally. And we are going to talk about kind of the constitutional issues with slavery at first, and we're going to kind of break down different measures and ways that the North and South tried to come to some sort of semblance of an agreement with how slavery would work when it comes to states and the admittance of new states into the Union. So let's go ahead and we're going to just get jumped right into this here. If you remember, when we go back and look at the Constitutional Convention, slavery was still a divisive issue. One of the big things behind the divisive issue of slavery, if you guys can remember all the way back to the Constitutional Unit, was how was slavery to be treated? Was it to be treated as their population numbers? Are they people? Or are they treated as property? Because remember, the North wanted to tax them if they were counted as property, and then they wouldn't be counted towards population. The South didn't want to be taxed on them like property, but they wanted them to count towards population representative, and that's where the infamous Three-Fifths Compromise comes into play. So that's the initial first time that the United States sits down and says, how do we deal with the issue of slavery? And this is the very first step of looking at the differences between the North and the South when it comes to slavery. Again, a lot of this, if you study it deeply, goes back to a lot of Puritan beliefs. And also the second thing, and later on as we start to move towards it, remember it's economic in nature, where industrialization doesn't necessarily need slave labor in order for it to function efficiently and effectively. Initially, so what we look at is that this creates the balance of power, because now they have some representation of their population in the South towards the House of Representation, House of Representatives, excuse me, and then you see a little bit of a balancing act. The other thing, though, that does happen is that in the Constitution, it states that they can't stop the slave trade until 1808. Now, in Congress in 1807 decides they're going to get a jump start on this because they know that that expiration date's coming. So they go ahead in 1807, they enacted the 1808 Act prohibiting the importation of slaves, and it went into effect immediately in 1808. So at this point, importing slaves is now illegal. You can no longer bring new slaves in over from Africa, or you can't bring them up from the Caribbean too. Did this end the slave trade? No, you still had illegal slaving going on with people bringing slaves from Africa, and more so lots of times coming up from the Caribbean to the South and importing slaves that way. The British took a really aggressive stand against slave trading. So if you were caught on the high seas with slaves, there's a good chance that you would never be seen again, or you'd be taken back to Britain, depending on where you were from, and you would basically not have a life anymore after that. But this is where Congress, for the very first time, looks at it and says, we now have an opportunity, let's end slavery, or at least the importation of slaves, and try to get on the path towards eventually ending slavery. That's the hope anyways. So the next problem that we have is you start looking at the compromises that are made when new states start being admitted. The entire idea here is that you need to maintain some sort of balance, and it's not balance when it comes to House of Representation, it's balance in the Senate. Because if there's balance in the Senate between the North and the South, even if the House of Representatives tries to pass a law outlawing slavery, the Senate can, if it's balanced North and South, the Senate can pretty much always stop whatever's trying to come through and end it in its tracks. That's the kind of the idea and the philosophy here. If we can prevent it from the South, we'll continue to have slavery from here. So what happens is that Missouri wants to come into the United States, no longer wants to be a territory, but it wants to come in as a slave state. And the North is going, well, if there's another slave state, maybe there's a way that they can enact stronger slave laws. And so they decide that they need to figure out a way to balance this again, because neither side wants to give up that power. Eventually, when you start looking at these compromises, it's not necessarily about the issue directly of slavery, it's an issue of power and representation. And I'll talk about that here in just a moment. But when you look at it, Henry Clay decides to intervene and say, hey, let's figure this out so we're not going to have a big fight on our hands here in the middle of the country. So they come to what's called the Missouri Compromise. And the first thing that they do is they're going to add Missouri and they're going to add Maine. That way you have a balance of the two states coming in. So Maine finally splits away from Massachusetts. This is how it happens finally, guys. So he also presents another portion of the plan. United States, they take an imaginary line and they cut it across the Louisiana Purchase. You kind of have a unique barrier here now between slave states and free states. You first have the Mason-Dixon line, as you can see on my little picture over here, which was the initial separation point between free and slave. And then you have now the Missouri Compromise line. Now, Missouri does come in as a slave state, as you can see, but after that, anything that would be below 60 degrees and 30 minutes northern latitude, those would still be allowed to be slaves. Anything above that in the Louisiana Purchase would be a free state. Now, again, this is a key point that you need to understand here. This only applies to the Louisiana Purchase. The United States does not yet have the Spanish/Mexican territory yet, so that is where this dividing line ends. And this creates problems pretty soon here. And you're going to see that here, but this is when you're looking at this map right here and you're looking off to the side, that's where the initial disagreements are going to be looked at going forward. Starting off here, the Louisiana Purchase is the only place the Missouri Compromise is impacting. Second thing that they decide to do is they continue to accommodate both of each other. So when Arkansas comes in as a slave, Michigan comes in as a free. When Florida pops in as a slave, Iowa comes in as a free. You suddenly remember, if you guys remember when we're talking about Texas, Texas was problematic when it first showed up. They wanted to join the Union, but the United States was going, well, two problems. First, you're going to come in as a slave state, and we don't have a balanced state to offset that. Second, this can start a war with Mexico. So there's the 8-year delay, if you guys remember that. And then eventually they show up into the Union, which then they allow Wisconsin into the balance, the slave versus free states going forward. So as you can see, there's a constant compromise coming back and forth. There is a problem, though, that now hits because you start looking at, again, the Louisiana Purchase, and Americans are going westward, and they had just taken over the Mexican territories. Remember, at the end of the Mexican-American War, Mexico gives the United States pretty much all the rest of the western United States territory. So, how do you continue to compromise of this? Well, one of the things is that oh, sorry, I thought I was going to put, if you look at my slide, the North thought slavery could be ended with new western states. But the South was worried that it also would be prevented from creating more slave states. And one of the reasons why that they have this thought process is David Wilmot. He creates a proposal that says, you know, none of this was covered underneath the Missouri Compromise. Why don't we just make the entire West free? Missouri Compromise doesn't technically go all the way over there, so at this point, all these new territories should just be free territories. And this is met with massive pushback from the South. And this is his attempt to make the West free the entire way, was put on multiple spending bills and was defeated multiple times. So he was actively and aggressively pushing for this idea, and so were other northern senators and representatives. And when these ideas start getting pushed heavily, the South actually gets together. They have a meeting talking about possibly leaving the Union if this happens. If the Western states all are now going to be free states, and eventually they'll have more senators, more representatives, and eventually they're going to be able to abolish slavery completely. The South thought to themselves, well, we don't have anything to lose at this point. We want to keep our slaves, so why don't we go ahead and think about starting to leave? Their wind kind of gets caught up in the North that this is something that's being talked about in the South. So Henry Clay again shows back up again. He goes, hey guys, I have another compromise. And so he creates what's known as the Compromise of 1850. It's made up of 3 sections. Now, If you notice on my slide, I put a technicality on there. It's more than 3 different things were agreed to during this time frame, but we're going to focus on the 3 core because there's a lot of little smaller nuanced elements, and if you guys want to study it, I highly recommend you look it up. But the main 3 things that they're going to look at is that California first is going to pop in as a free state, and then New Mexico and Utah territories, they split those and they create them, and then they say you guys are going to be able to choose if you want to be free or slave. You guys have a decision in this process now. And lastly is that they were going to enact the 1850 Fugitive Slave Law, and this is going to be a big deal in the North, especially since it becomes a federal issue. But basically what it means is if any slaves escape to the North, they are not automatically free. Instead, they are going to still have to be returned back to the southern plantation owners to which they quote unquote belong to. And this creates massive issues up north. All right, so with Utah territory and the New Mexico territory now being established and given the right themselves to choose if they want to be free or slave, this creates the idea of what's known as popular sovereignty. So Lewis Class is the one who brings up that idea of popular sovereignty. The line ends, that Missouri Compromise line, that ends. That's no longer going all the way to the Pacific Ocean. It stops here. And once you now are looking to apply to become a territory or a state, you will have a vote among all your people of the territory or state, and you would make that determination yourself. No longer would Congress be involved, no longer would the president be involved, no longer would other states be able to pressure you. You are just going to make the decision on your own. And this what the goal is to try to prevent friction between congressional members here and also between states, because they're going to say, well, we're going to make this a democratic choice for these states now in these new territories going forward. So no longer are we going to say you are going to be free, you're going to be slave, you have a voice into it. And while this creates a temporary fix to the solution, like I say here, a band-aid, eventually that band-aid is going to rip apart, and you're going to see violence start to occur out on the frontier in these territories looking to become states, where you're going to have northerners and southerners rush to those new territories and try to sway those elections, and often with bloody consequences. All right, guys, well, that ends this section right here. We will go ahead and probably tomorrow we're going to look at possibly doing just a worksheet so we can give you a little bit more information. If we do a worksheet, it's going to be just like my other multiple choice sections. I will have the worksheet there in a PDF form. You'll look through it instead of filling out the worksheet. You'll just answer questions that we'll have below it. All right, guys, well, have a good rest of the day and make sure you do the homework, and I will see you shortly.